Hello, we are so sorry for the delay. So welcome everyone to our first ever Google On Air event from UCLA Alumni Affairs, Living Globally, Preparing and Planning for a Move Abroad. And again, sorry for the delay. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Angela Scales, and I am a fellow Bruin, and I serve as the Senior Director of Young Alumni and Student Engagement here at the UCLA Alumni Association. Thank you again for joining us. To set the stage for today's event and the Living Globally series, we frequently hear from alumni who are pursuing opportunities internationally. And we wanted to bring the UCLA community together to learn from fellow Bruins living and working abroad. We hope that today's session will be interactive and that you'll find it helpful in your global endeavors. Before I introduce David, let's take care of just a few quick housekeeping measures. On the right-hand side of the screen, there should be a questions panel. If you don't see this, please click on the Google Grid icon in the upper right corner and select questions. Here you can type in your questions throughout the session. Also, if you see a question that you like or one that you would have asked yourself, click the +1 icon. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. And now on to the main event. Our speaker today is David Lee, a graduate of the UCLA School of Law in 2006. David is a director at Pedder Street Investment Management, an investment firm that invests across the Asia ex-Japan region. Prior to that, David was with Goldman Sachs and Katzenbach Partners. In addition to his law degree from UCLA, David holds graduate degrees from Harvard University and the London School of Economics. David has lived in London, Beijing, Seoul, and he currently lives in Hong Kong. David is originally from Texas. So with that, let's get started. David, why don't you start by telling us about why you first moved abroad and a little background about your subsequent travels.
Thanks. Again, apologies for the delay. In terms of, I guess, my background, I guess it's important to note, my father was in the military, in the U.S. Army, and so we spent most of our lives, my life growing up, kind of wandering and being stationed in a few different places across the United States and abroad. So I kind of had that wanderlust imposed on me from when I was younger. But when I was graduating from law school, I had already done a few internships and study abroads during different stints in my educational career. So I kind of knew at a certain level I always wanted to do something outside of the U.S. And I wasn't sure what form that would take, but I just kind of had that itch. And so the first job really that I did out of law school was joining a large corporate law firm, doing a brief stint with a large corporate law firm in Korea. And that was kind of a way for me to professionally kind of scratch this itch I had, as well as kind of issues that were specific to Korea that I was interested in. And so that was kind of the initial impetus abroad, and that led to a few different things, including moving to Hong Kong for the first time and joining Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong. And so actually, this is the second time I've lived in Hong Kong. So, but yeah, it's a bit of a story.
So, David, one of the first topics that often comes to mind about moving abroad is potential language barriers. Can you share with us a little bit about how you prepared for that?
I think, fortunately, the first time I really moved abroad professionally was to Korea, and just by, I kind of grew up in a Korean household. I spoke enough Korean that it was fine. I guess the first time I had a kind of this language barrier difficulty, was when I was living in Beijing. Because at the time I didn't speak Chinese, or I didn't speak Mandarin. And so, I guess there's two schools of thought when it comes to that. This idea of a language barrier. The first is, I really got to go there and learn and, kind of buckle down and kind of get my language studies in order. And I think that's a great way to approach it. I think language is one of those things that obviously is a great skill to pick up that pays dividends for the rest of your life. And so when I moved to China, I spent a lot of time studying Chinese. That said, there are a lot of people that move to foreign countries and never learn the language, and they survive fine. I mean, you can just go down to any ethnic enclave in Los Angeles and find people that don't really speak English, and they still do okay. So I don't think language barrier in of itself should be a reason not to try to do something abroad. And I think if you are a somewhat proactive and a go-getter, and you end up learning the language and committing to that, then I think it's one of those things that really is something that's beneficial for your whole life, both personally and professionally.
Definitely. So another immediate need for those moving abroad is finding housing. Can you tell us a little bit about how you navigated the housing search and what, if any, resources did you utilize?
Yeah, for me, I fortunately, I felt like I had a fairly strong professional and personal network in a lot of the places that I moved to. So I don't think it was too difficult to find housing. I spent, but before I made the move abroad, I spent a lot of time kind of reaching out to people to kind of set up certain things and try to figure out, what may work, what might not work. I think now increasingly with so many tools online, I think the housing issue is really not too difficult, to be frank. And there are always it's particularly in areas where younger alumni might be moving to, in larger kind of metropolitan areas in different parts of the world. You won't be unique in moving to this country, or moving to a Shanghai or to a Beijing or to a Madrid or something like that. There will be plenty of people that have already done it before you, and so there'll be plenty of tools and advice that really online. But I mean, for me, the biggest tool was kind of going out in my personal network and trying to reach out to people that I knew, or people that I knew that knew other people in those geographies. And so, I mean, I guess beyond that, besides those places I've lived, I've spent a lot of time traveling in South Asia and Southeast Asia, in places like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Malaysia, places like that. And definitely, even in those situations, reaching out to using my personal network was probably by far the most useful tool for me. But like I said, I think there are a lot of tools online that are definitely available.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So one area that people don't often think about is healthcare. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in that area?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Partly because the worst thing is if something bad happens, you get in an accident or you get sick while you're abroad and you don't have that covered. And I think a lot of people maybe overlook that because maybe you're probably fairly young and fairly healthy. Fortunately there are a lot of travel insurance providers out there that provide insurance for fairly cheap, and that will generally cover you for fairly catastrophic, difficult situations, including kind of, if it gets to that point, I think there's a level of, returning back to the U.S. or wherever your home is for medical treatment. So, I think it's definitely something that I would definitely encourage, particularly if you're in the areas of the world where the medical kind of care is not the greatest. I think if you're in areas of the world where it's actually not too bad, maybe a little less critical, particularly if the quality is fairly okay and the cost isn't too bad. That may be an alternative, but I think as a general rule of thumb, kind of procuring travel insurance or travel medical insurance before leaving is probably something that would be recommended.
Great. So one of the major topics we wanted to cover is really the driving force behind the move abroad. So that would be the job. For some, they move abroad without one, and others might move abroad because their job in the States is taking them abroad. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and give us your advice for those who are moving abroad in search of a job, and then those who are being relocated by their company here?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with so I think that first of all, I think that's a great question. I think almost everybody that is kind of in at least in the for-profit space, like working in corporates, will probably face some situation like this at some point. Increasingly more so as the world is kind of globalized and kind of those very cliche terms now, but I mean it's a reality. So maybe I'll start with the latter part first, where like if your company is moving you abroad. In those situations, I find it's quite easy. Generally, the company will kind of engage service providers to facilitate this transition process. and they've done so for multiple employees over many years. So that is pretty easy. They can take care of the housing, they can take care of your health insurance. Potentially, if you have children, they can take care of the schooling and where, how that's going to play out. I think perhaps more on point to people that, to students that are listening, or young alumni that may be interested in moving abroad earlier in their career, and maybe looking for employment. I've definitely kind of done that a few times, and for me, it was a wonderful experience for me to do that, because in retrospect, it built a lot of character. Because you kind of move abroad, and it's like you pretty much have to create your own destiny. You have really no safety net, and that for me was incredibly. That experience just taught me a lot about myself, being resilient, uh, and kind of being very proactive in trying to achieve, you know, whatever goals, employment goals that you have. So I think in that process, using the alumni networks, if you're a Bruin, obviously using the UCLA Alumni Network, and if you have multiple alumni networks that you can tap into, I think that really creates a positive synergy for you to kind of hopefully land an ideal role. I think in a lot of places that you go to, or people might go to overseas, large commercial centers like a Hong Kong or London or Tokyo, places like that. If you're super aggressive using your network and meeting people, you'll find after you do that for a certain period of time that you really have met a lot of people in your particular industry or space that you want to be in. And so the side benefit of doing that is actually not just landing the job, but once you land, hopefully you land the job, now you have a professional network in place that you can also use to help you in your career. And I think maybe the last note related to that is I'm a firm believer in karma, and I really benefited from people who took time out to say, hey, like I'll have, I'll grab lunch with you, or let's have a quick, meet me at the juice bar downstairs. We'll grab a juice or a coffee or whatever. I really benefited from people taking like 10, 15, 20 minutes out of their day to do that, and then kind of vouching for me. Um, you know, Forwarding my resume on, introducing me to other people, and so I try to go out of my way now for people that kind of do that. People that are also, people that are in this a situation I was in a few, let's say 10 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it was. So I try to go out of my way to kind of pay it forward. So I think that's probably an important thing to remember as well, just that there's karma in that, and so once you make it to help others.
We love that. You're a great Bruin. So we're going to take a question from the audience. The question is not travel insurance, but what about normal health insurance when you're living abroad?
So I see. So okay, so this is, I guess the question would be more if you're there in a long-term situation, as opposed to like, oh, I'm just studying there for 3 months or 6 months. Yeah, I think in that case, normally if you're there on a longer-term program with a school, or you're employed, you will either be required to pay for insurance, or you will be given insurance as part of your remuneration or your employment package. So I think in situations where you're there in the long term, I think at very least you'll have some basic level of health coverage. Now I guess the question remains then, if you want kind of an added level of medical coverage or healthcare, if you want to pay for that out of pocket. And I think those opportunities exist in a lot of places. And so, and places like you find, particularly like in Hong Kong or Korea, if you're there kind of if you're there with with a job with an employment visa, generally you can participate to a certain degree in kind of the national healthcare system there. And the healthcare generally is fairly good at fairly good prices, though maybe there's a time delay, to be honest. And then anything beyond kind of the basic general health care, you may have to pay a little bit more out of pocket. And then I think for those situations, that really is a decision that would be up to the individual. about what their healthcare needs are, and if they have consistent healthcare needs that's costing them money out of pocket, and obviously engaging kind of supplementary health insurance providers is probably the best way to be. But at a basic level, if you're there, if you're somewhere on a long-term basis, ostensibly for school or for work, then that should probably be taken care of.
So you've clearly had a lot of experience moving abroad and making those job transitions. So what are the factors that alumni should consider when they're in that decision-making process?
Yeah, that's tough to kind of give good advice on, because I think everybody's path is so idiosyncratic. Everybody's kind of on their own journey. Obviously, I think general principles about making sure you're working with good people, and hopefully you get good mentors and things like that is great. I think one thing that particularly overlooked, or two things I guess that are important to keep in mind is, what's particularly if you go abroad to work, you do have to think about exit at some point. So that could be a geographic exit. At some point, maybe I want to come back to the U.S. So what does that path look like for me? If you go abroad, let's say right out of college, and say, hey, I'm going to go teach English in Japan or China, that could be a great experience for some people. But the likelihood that you'll be able to find a job back in the U.S. doing the same thing is going to be quite difficult, because everybody speaks English, or most people speak English. So, kind of understanding, okay, if I do want to make it back or progress in my career, what does that entail? And so that could be a geographic type of thing. Like, how do I come back from going abroad, and what does that look like? And for young people, for a lot of young alumni, that could be going back to grad school, to be honest. But, the other thing is, if you go abroad and professionally, let's say you don't want to come back to school, and maybe you don't even want to come back to the U.S. for the time being, but you want to progress in your career. I think it's important you have to be a lot more focused kind of on this career management aspect of your life, because it's really easy, and I've seen it so many times, of people who move abroad earlier in their career, and they kind of get stuck, and because they weren't in organizations that kind of nurtured them, and then at the same time they didn't take the initiative to self-develop themselves. And then once you do that for a few years, it's really difficult to get out of that situation. And so you end up just kind of floating between unfulfilling job to unfulfilling job. And if you do that after a few years, it's not very fun.
So in looking at the questions from the audience, so do you leave work visa concerns to the employer, or should you try to handle those yourself?
That's a very jurisdictional specific question or answer, meaning depending on where you go in the world, the answer will change. So in places like the US or the UK, it's almost impossible to show. I mean, assuming you're not a US citizen, right, and you show up in the US trying to find a job, that's going to be really tough. There's only going to be a handful type of industries and employers that will sponsor you for a work visa. Now, in places like Hong Kong, for example, or Singapore, that is a little bit more fluid, and it's a little bit easier, significantly easier than the U.S. or the U.K. to get employment visas. So once you secure a role, it's very easy for an employer to get you a visa. I would say, 70-80% of the time, I guess taking a step back, 70-80% of the time, it's the employer or school or whoever that will be securing the visa on your behalf. So until you have that relationship in place, you actually probably won't be able to get a visa anyways, right?
So in somewhat of a similar vein, if your company wants you to move abroad, what are the specific things that you should be asking about when you're looking at the package and the compensation in those negotiations?
Yeah, if you're going to a place in the world, particularly that has a higher cost of living than where you're at, so generally speaking, most places in Asia, kind of developed places in Asia, will have a higher cost of living than in the U.S., except outside of maybe New York or something. So, you definitely, hopefully, will try to have some sort of housing kind of stipend or package built into your compensation, you probably, if your company's large, you'll be able to negotiate that. You'll probably be able to negotiate trips home during the holidays in the summer. Um, I think education costs for if you have kids, I think that's huge. And I think those are probably those kind of things to where you basically, particularly if you're working for a big company, you want to be able to negotiate a package for yourself where you're not at any personal or financial disadvantage by making them move abroad. So they should equalize you to the same level of quality of life that you have currently before moving. So, for example, if you're living fairly comfortable middle class life in Los Angeles, and your company wants you to move to Tokyo, and the package they're giving you actually puts you in a lower kind of quality of life level in Japan than you otherwise had, and you probably definitely want to reconsider that move.
That's great advice. So, another question that someone has asked in the audience, a great one, is are there UCLA alumni groups in Hong Kong and in China? And I know the answer is yes, but I'm curious, in your experience, have you reached out to and connected to the alumni networks in the different cities that you've been?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I've been, I participate quite a bit in the UCLA law alumni groups, kind of where I've been. And so I definitely have benefited from that. I mean, to the level of I got a job because of this alumni connection that I was able to kind of leverage. So it's definitely been beneficial for me. I think my participation in these things is not for the sole reason of trying to advance my career, because I genuinely am interested in kind of meeting people and kind of hearing their stories and being helpful if I can. But I definitely have found that it's been quite helpful for me. I know for a fact in Hong Kong, the larger UCLA alumni group is quite active. I think that's the case in Korea as well. And so, I guess for those that are moving abroad, I would definitely recommend reaching out to those groups.
We love hearing that. So another question from the audience, what are some of the emotional or mental transitions that people moving abroad should anticipate and kind of prepare for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that gets overlooked quite a bit. I think there's basically two things. One, it gets lonely at times. And so in the sense that, I've been living abroad off and on, I don't know, the last 8-10 years. So for me, it's very comfortable now. Like this type of lifestyle is, it's just life. But I think early, when you move abroad, particularly like that, those first few months or a year or whatnot, it can be quite lonely. I mean, you have Skype and all these other technical, these internet-based tools that really facilitate communication. But you definitely miss the opportunity, like, hey, calling a friend or a family member up and like, hey, let's just go grab a burger, let's just go down the street and go watch a movie. Those kind of interactions, you're not going to have that, and you miss that. You miss having your support network, I think. So there's definitely a sense of kind of loneliness, I guess, that you just need to be aware of. And it's not all the time, but maybe around the holidays, you're not going home for the holidays or things like that. So I think there's a sense of that. But also I think you have to have a sense of I don't know if patience is the right word to describe it, but for the lack of a better word that's coming to mind, I think being patient, because inevitably things are going to be really different where you are than where you came from, and it's easy to fall into the mental habit of being well, back home they do it this way and it would have been faster, and this is so whatever. And I think getting out of that kind of negative thinking, I think, is really important. And kind of having, I guess, so I just call that patience, but I'm sure there's better words to describe that. But kind of going with the flow to a certain level. Obviously, if you go to China, there are a lot of things sometimes in China, pollution, things aren't great, but there's so much that's so fascinating. And living in China off and on the last few years has been such a great experience for me. And I've had to kind of like be patient and kind of try to think from the other perspective. And at the end of the day, most of these societies, they've been around for thousands of years. They've been around much longer than the United States. So it's almost a bit arrogant to come and say, oh, well, we're so much better. And kind of that kind of attitude, I definitely don't think is helpful or conducive to having a good experience abroad. Obviously, that's quite commonsensical, but I think when you're in that moment and you're quite frustrated because of a certain process of buying a train ticket or something that doesn't make sense to you, I think it's important to remember.
So another question here from the audience asks, how would you suggest going about job searching specifically in the UK?
Yeah, so the UK is a very difficult nut to crack. And so the reason I say that is, unless you are a UK national or a citizen of the EU, it's really difficult to get visa sponsorship. And so if the idea is that you're going to show up and just find a full-time job, and you are not a UK citizen or a EU national, then you probably want to rethink that, particularly because the cost of living is so high in cities like London. Now, if you're going there on a study abroad, or like a 1 or 2 year master's degree, like I did. So I went to the LSE to do a master's, and people go to the LSE. I think Cambridge, Oxford, LSE, and 1 or 2 other schools is not uncommon. I think in those situations, your visa does allow you to work under certain conditions, and so that's how I initially started working when I was in London. But that said, the UK is a very difficult labor market if you don't already have visa sponsorship. And there are companies that do provide it, but their preference is almost always to have a UK or an EU national.
That's really helpful. To switch gears, kind of the same question, but for China, how do you suggest going about looking for jobs in China while you're still in the US, and are there any good websites or networking channels that you would recommend?
So I think your job search in China becomes a lot easier if you speak Chinese. That sounds really simple, but I mean, it's just if you speak Chinese, and the better it is, the easier it will be. So that's the first kind of common sense kind of truth. In terms of tools, what people I have found in my own kind of reaching out to people, as well as like people that have reached out to me. I think using alumni groups and networks, you can always reach out to chapter heads and whoever beforehand. So I think that's fine. I think some of these groups will have potential job search kind of distribution kind of listservs that they circulate. So if an alumni or somebody is looking for somebody, they may circulate an email to the alumni group. Now these are kind of informal ways of just disseminating information, but it's important if you're not there to try to tap into that. So one way of doing that is by kind of contacting alumni beforehand. I think LinkedIn is a great tool, to be honest. So just finding people who look like they may have something in common with you, and trying to reach out to them, I think is a really good way to do that. But then also I think just doing alumni search, off the UCLA. I'm assuming UCLA has this tool as well, like you can kind of search for alumni, and then some of them have noted that they're willing to take to receive contact from people that are reaching out for career advice and such. I definitely would kind of use that and kind of reach out to alumni who have as much in common with you. And I definitely feel like people that are living abroad are generally more likely or willing to, I think, take time out to chat about their experience because they've gone through it themselves at a certain point. And so I think we find people really, I guess your ticket will be a bit higher than it otherwise would be maybe like in the U.S. So I think just kind of taking the time to reach out to people via email, alumni network, LinkedIn, and kind of doing it in a nice way. Like, uh, don't have a sense of entitlement. The kind of the most annoying thing is getting these emails and people are, just like, hey, I'm looking for a job. Here's my resume. Are you hiring? I think those kind of content or reaching out that way is definitely less helpful, and you're less likely to get a response, at least from, just at least personally for me. I mean, I find that somewhat, it kind of puts me off a little bit. So I think definitely reaching out in a more, kind of just in a nice way, I think is probably more effective. And then definitely always following up with kind of thank you emails and things like that. It's amazing how many people don't do that, by the way.
That's great advice. So a question kind of in the world of taxes from the audience. One of them says, how have you been compensated for possible double taxation of income both from the U.S. and then abroad? And so if so, how do you know what should be included in the negotiated compensation package?
Yeah. So let me just take a step back and talk a little bit about U.S. taxes. So this is all assuming you are a U.S. citizen and you're moving abroad, and you're you're in Korea or you're in Spain or whatever, and you're working. Now, so I'm a U.S. citizen, so I have this information as well. So we are, even due to our U.S. citizenship, we have the privilege of paying tax anywhere we are in the world. It's a very unique thing. The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that taxes their citizens globally. So, like, let me put it on the flip side. If I was a citizen of Korea, for example, South Korea, and I was working in the U.S., I wouldn't have to pay Korean taxes generally. I would only just pay U.S. taxes. That's not the case in the U.S. If you're a U.S. citizen and you go abroad, you are liable. You have tax liabilities both of where you're working as well as U.S. tax liabilities. Now, that said, the U.S. has, kind of the first thing to point out, the U.S. as a taxpayer, you have what's called a foreign income tax exemption. And every year or every 2 years or so, that number slightly changes. Generally, it goes up. Ballpark, I don't know. I think it's like $80,000 or $90,000 right now. So if you make, let's say your salary is $80,000 or $90,000, whatever, it falls right at the limit of the foreign income tax exemption that you get from the IRS. Then you only have to pay taxes in your home jurisdiction. All right. And then there are added benefits that are tacked onto that. So in theory, your foreign income tax exemption could be a bit higher than that, depending on what you're including and what you're deducting and all these kind of things. At a certain point where, let's say, your income exceeds whatever your foreign income tax exemptions are, then you are liable for U.S. taxes on that, and you have to pay those taxes. But you can deduct generally speaking, you can deduct your so this is all very like hypothetical. So let me just give you an example. So if you are working in Hong Kong and you make, let's say, $200, and let's say $100. So in Hong Kong, you'll have to pay taxes on all $200. And then your U.S. tax liability, you have U.S. tax liability as well as on that $200. But on the first $80 or $90 or so, you'll get some foreign income tax exemption. So even you'll get exempted from those taxes. So on the remaining $100 or $110 worth of taxes, you have to pay U.S. taxes, but you can deduct what you've already paid in Hong Kong, and then you just pay the difference to the U.S. Now, in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong's a low tax regime, you oftentimes in that situation, you'll end up paying a bit more money to the U.S. On the flip side, if you were to live in London, where in the UK they generally have a higher tax regime than in the US, you actually could be building up tax credits against your US income tax because you're paying way more in taxes than you would be liable for than in the US. So that's also a very jurisdictional specific thing. And I know that was it probably sounds really confusing. I didn't explain it very well there, but I think tax is an important thing, and it's also that'll be very much driven by where you're working and how much you're making. And then you'll be able to figure out like how much of your U.S. income tax exemption that you can use, and what your real tax liability will end up being. But it's an important point, particularly as you get a little bit older in your career. I think and you're making hopefully financially doing a little bit better. It's definitely a tax point to consider.
That's great to know. It's making
that too, sorry, related to that too is like charitable deductions. Like, you're paying, if you pay charitable deductions to the Red Cross in the U.S. or to your church or whatever, and you normally get tax deductions for that. In certain situations, it could be better to pay those charitable contributions to a local charitable organization and get those tax deductions in your local jurisdiction as opposed to continuing paying them in the U.S. It just really depends on your tax situation. So I think there's a lot of like moving parts in that, but it's definitely an important point to consider.
That's great advice. It sounds like finances could be an entire topic of a future event in the series. So another question in that money realm from the audience is, do you keep all your salary, etc., in a bank in your new city and just keep a small amount in the U.S., or what do you advise?
Yeah, that's also a very specific, person-specific issue. A lot of that will be driven by, just broadly speaking, it'll be driven by two things. The first will be, do you have liabilities, or basically, let's say debt? Do you have debt that you need to pay in the U.S., i.e., student debt, for example? If so, then you're gonna have to send money back to cover that at certain intervals. Now, wire transfers is, they charge, it costs. So that to kind of be maybe a little bit efficient in that, it probably makes sense to send back money, every few months as opposed to every time you get a paycheck, if you can afford to do that, where you can just send one big chunk over, and then that'll cover your costs for, like, say, 6 months in the U.S. So a lot of that will be driven by, do you have costs or debt that you need to take care of in the U.S.? And then the second thing will be is, what currency are you getting paid in? Now, if you're getting paid, so I get my salary, for example, in Hong Kong, generally in Hong Kong dollars. I get paid in Hong Kong dollars. Now, the way the FX exchange works between Hong Kong and the U.S. is basically the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the U.S. dollar, so there's not a lot of foreign currency fluctuation. So basically, if I have U.S. dollar debt, it's very easy to calculate because I know my Hong Kong dollars are not going to change. Now, for example, if you're getting paid in Korean won, but you have U.S. debt, that could be a little bit more volatile for you because there have been a few times in the last 10 to 15 years where the Korean won has declined in value, like 50%. And all of a sudden, that means your debt has increased 50% because you have to change more won over to U.S. dollars to pay your debt in the U.S. So it's important to kind of consider that and understand kind of fluctuations in foreign exchange as you think about your own kind of financial situation. That said, obviously, if you're somewhere for a long period of time, you probably definitely want to have bank accounts in both locations, both in the U.S. as well as in your foreign location, and banks that are comfortable doing kind of overseas banking, that kind of stuff. I think related to that, you want to find banks that will allow you to take money out of your ATM. So, like, you could go to an ATM globally and be able to withdraw money at little to no cost. So, fortunately, I was, you just need to find the certain banks like that work for you, and that will facilitate that. And then also related to that is like credit cards as well. So if you want to use U.S. credit card for whatever reasons abroad, then it behooves you to find a credit card that doesn't charge foreign transaction fees, which could be like anywhere from like 1 to 3% of your bill. So and just finding those kind of things kind of make things a bit easier.
Great point. So another interesting question from the audience is, if a person is moving abroad not for a job but for the adventure, what criteria is important to think about when they're considering a place to settle?
So I guess you have the assumption that this person, money is not an issue. Not that they have to live luxuriously, but that they may not need to work for a certain period of time.
Right, or maybe they are looking to retire abroad.
I see. Okay. I think in that situation, definitely, ease of financial kind of, like what we just discussed in the previous question. Like are you in a place that makes it easy to get money in and money out for you to withdraw money? That sounds almost, I think living in the U.S. or have only lived in developed countries for a long time, that sounds like very like, wow, it's like ADD. It's so easy, of course. But you know, I've been to countries as early as like a few years ago. I was in a country where there were no international ATMs in the country. So your U.S. bank card or Hong Kong or Korean bank card or whatever that would not work in that country. Only domestic ATM cards work in that country. There, as far I don't know if this is true, but I was told that there are only two places in the whole country that actually took international credit cards, and they only took them in the morning between like 9 and 11. And if you miss that window, you can't use your credit card for the rest of the day in the country. And so, you know, you just want to be sure you're in an area or a country or jurisdiction that I guess it would be smooth for you to be able to, you know, kind of take care of your financial needs, etc. Because the worst thing is like being in a kind of exotic or remote part of the world and not having money and trying to figure out how to survive. So hopefully nobody ends up in that situation. I think other than that, like you know, the other things that you would think about, unless you just are going there to be a beach bum, are like how you're going to be engaged while you're wherever you end up. And it could be through volunteer work. It could be through, oh, I'm going to write a book while I'm there, or you know, I'm going to work on my internet startup, and you know, I just want to find somewhere secluded that has a good internet connection. And I think again, that's probably more democratic type of decision-making process. It really depends on the individual criteria. But besides normal things like, you know, like what I mentioned, the financial situation or health, and you know, obviously geopolitical considerations. Like you know, if you're trying to write a book, you probably don't want to go to somewhere that is like a war-torn country. You're looking for peace and quiet. So, I mean, just those kind of simple considerations I think are important to keep in mind.
So another question that is probably near to your heart right now is, what about when alumni are moving abroad with children? What are the things that you should think about before and after the move?
Yeah. So inevitably, what's going to happen? So I'll assume in that question that you have a partner, a spouse, or someone going with you. So there's a okay, this family will have the adults and there'll be children there, right? And inevitably, one spouse or partner will be following the other. And that sounds, again, really commonsensical, but it's a very hard thing for your partner. Almost 9 times out of 10, it's very difficult. Because your partner or spouse is moving across the world for you to pursue a career opportunity. I.e., that's great for you, but for them, they have to leave behind their support network, their family, their friends, their job, potentially. And, I speak from personal experience because my wife has had to do this a few times because of me. And so it can be a very difficult thing. And so it requires a high level of discussion, probably over a long period of time, to make sure everybody's on board, starting with your spouse or partner or whatever. I would say after that, it's like the kids, and then assuming your children don't have any special needs, medical needs or whatnot that require them to be, near a specific type of medical service center or whatever, assuming there are none of those kinds of issues, then you start thinking about, okay, school, like where are we going to be sending to this school? Almost anywhere you go in the world will have schools, but are these the type of schools that our children are going to? If they're good international schools, who's going to be paying for that? A lot of the international schools in Hong Kong, for example, are easily can run you $20,000 or $30,000 a year. So it's as much as going to college, right? And if you're already paying that from like first grade, and you do that for the next 12 years till your child graduates from high school, that costs more than all my education. Let's put it that way. And I've ended up doing probably too many degrees. And so for me, when I think about, I went to public schools in the U.S. I didn't have to pay $30,000 a year, $20,000 a year for my primary and high school education. I think I turned out okay. So for me, that's a dilemma that we face right now as a family. Like even for example, kindergarten or pre-K or whatever, where our daughter might be going to in a year or two, it could easily run $1,000 a month, and that would be a conservative in certain situations. So it doesn't make sense for your kid who's only going to be going to this pre-K or whatever program for 24 hours a day, and not even every day in Hong Kong, for example, not even every day, and still paying like almost $1,000 a month. Does that even make sense? I don't know. I mean, it really depends on what you want for your children, what your financial situations are, and kind of what makes sense for your particular family situation. But these type of discussions need to be had. Um, before making that move abroad, particularly if you have a spouse or partner and kids in tow. I think the other thing too, there's a lot of these places where there are a lot of expats, like in Hong Kong or Shanghai, um, or even in London. It can be difficult to get into school immediately because it's very competitive. There's only a limited number of slots. So the competition is not driven by SAT scores or something like that. It's just driven by supply and demand. There's a lot of potentially families or kids moving at particular times of the year, and there may not be enough spots at particular schools, and so you may not be able to get into the school that you want. You may have to send your child to kind of your third choice, or to a local school, or to do whatever. And those are the type of things that you just are, if you have a plan. So this is why, like, I guess the older and more responsibility that you get, you're getting married, having kids, whatever, it probably the move abroad, the plan to do that takes a lot longer, as opposed to when you're single.
So along the lines of your comment about expats, from the audience, someone asked, how and where do you begin looking for that expat American community when you get to a new country?
Yeah, so I guess at one level, I'm not a big fan of actually plugging in fully into the expat community personally. I think you live somewhat in a bubble when you do that. Um, Inevitably, though, particularly if your kids are going to like the international school or their American school in town, you kind of get sucked into that bubble. But I think it's important to try and kind of have as much of a local experience as you can and that you're comfortable with as well. That way, when you tell people you lived in a certain place, you can actually tell them that you did certain things there, as opposed to I lived in this particular apartment where everybody was from America and I don't have any friends from that particular country. I think those are the type of situations you want to avoid. I think it's a waste. You end up having that kind of experience abroad. I think it's very easy. It's not that hard to plug into those communities, to be honest. There'll be educational, like so schools. You have kids going to school that'll help you plug in. Religious, institutions, like so if you're going to church or synagogue or mosque or temple or whatever, there'll be those kind of institutions there that will enable you to plug in. I think a lot of kind of volunteer or sports clubs type of thing. I think those kind of things would make it easy to plug into. And then obviously through like alumni groups, so like American, so like if you went to UCLA or other schools in the U.S. And then plugging into those alumni groups. A lot of these places will have like a Thanksgiving dinner event, Christmas party, those kind of things. And then places like Hong Kong where there are a lot of Americans, there's I don't know, Democrats abroad, Republicans abroad. They host events, particularly during presidential election years. The U.S. consulate or embassy oftentimes hosts different events. So I think that's pretty much easy to find. I don't think it's not like those groups are hiding. That's if you want it, it's very easy to engage.
So David, as we wrap up, what is your #1 piece of advice for alumni who are considering making a move abroad?
Wow. um, hmm. I think um, I think it's something that everyone should have, like that kind of experience, spending time abroad outside the United States in some capacity. I mean, I think that just in the type of world we live in, spending any time abroad, it could be just traveling, it could be doing a 3-month study abroad. It could be doing a master's degree. It could be on a work exchange for a year, whatever it may be. I think the more you get of that, the more understanding it creates in the world. And so, that's obviously very like common sense type of stuff that we talk about a lot on campus, and you read about in the newspaper. But having experienced it myself, I think it's really true. But outside of that, I think it's important to feel comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so that sounds a little weird, but when moving abroad teaches you to thrive while you're in an uncomfortable setting. And meaning that not that it's painful, it's just a situation that you're maybe not have a high degree of familiarity with. And so but I think the more experience you have with that is I think the more the easier it is for you to adapt to or want to adapt to different situations in life. And I think at the source of all that, this idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, it creates hopefully lifelong curiosity. And so for me, definitely, I don't like being in situations now where, wow, I'm really comfortable now, and this could be my life for like the next 10 years or 15 years. I think at that point, I, me personally, I feel like I'm not learning, I'm not pushing myself. And so I always want to have a certain level of comfort, or a certain level of being comfortable. Because I just want to be curious. I want to be pushing myself. And I kind of want to continue to grow and learn, and not be in this inert state. And I think when you go abroad, that prods you. I mean, you are pushed to move out of your comfort zone. There's no choice. And so I think that's probably one of the coolest things about that. And as you inculcate that into your own personal into your personality, I think it gives you an extra perspective on life for the rest of your life.
That is excellent advice, David. Thank you so much. Your advice and experience have been so helpful and have shed light on many of the challenges and opportunities of living abroad. For our audience, thank you so much for joining us for our first Google On Air event and for participating in the discussion. To view this discussion again or to share it with others, the video will be available on the UCLA Alumni YouTube channel very soon. If you would like to be notified when the video is available, please send us an email at internationalnetworks@alumni.ucla.edu. As this is our first Google On Air event, we encourage you to provide feedback. Please send us an email with your questions, your thoughts, and ideas, because we look forward to incorporating that feedback into our future events. Lastly, if you're considering a move abroad and want to connect with fellow Bruins in the region, please contact our office, our Senior Director of International Outreach, Lily Tsao, at internationalnetworks@alumni.ucla.edu. Thank you again to David and to everyone for being a part of our first Living Globally discussion. We hope you'll join us for the next event in early March. And with that, happy holidays and go Bruins!